Miss Marple and the Enigma of the Enchanted Guard. Welcome back to Shadowed Pages. My dear friends, I'm Edward, and I'm truly delighted to have you join me once again this evening. Where are you tuning in from today, and how has your day been? I always enjoy hearing from you. Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now let's begin. It was one of those rare, perfect English mornings, the kind that come only 3 or 4 times in a good summer. The sky stretched above in a flawless arc of blue, and the air had that clarity that makes distant hills seem almost close enough to touch. Miss Jane Marple, seated comfortably in her corner of the railway carriage, gazed out at the passing countryside with quiet satisfaction. She was on her way to visit her dear old friend, Mrs. Lydia Markham, at Meadowbrook House. The invitation had arrived unexpectedly the week before, written in Lydia's familiar hand. It had suggested a visit would do Miss Marple a world of good, but Miss Marple, smiling at the thought, knew she had no shortage of country air back home in St. Mary Mead. Yet Lydia, dear friend though she was, had been a companion in her youth. And as the years passed, such friendships grew all the more precious. The train deposited her at Meadowbrook Halt, where Mrs. Markham's chauffeur awaited with the motor. He was a middle-aged man, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent in the elements before turning to driving. "Good morning, Miss Kisses," he said with the tip of his cap. "Mrs. Markham sends her apologies. She would have come herself, but her rheumatism's acting up something fierce this morning." "Dear Lydia," murmured Miss Marple, "I do hope it's nothing serious." "Oh no, miss. She's quite cheerful, really. It's just the damp, you know." As they passed through the village, Miss Marple observed everything with her usual quiet attentiveness. The village was charming in that typical way of English villages that had changed little over the years. Shops, a baker, a butcher, a small drapery shop. She noted with interest the herb shop, its window filled with dried bundles of flowers. As Meadowbrook House came into view through the iron gates, Miss Marple couldn't help but admire the Georgian architecture. Its honey-colored stone glowed warmly under the morning sun, and the gardens surrounding it, with their roses and herbaceous borders, spoke of love and care. Mrs. Markham greeted her at the door, using a walking stick but otherwise looking in good spirits. "Jane, how wonderful to see you. Come in, come in. You must be exhausted from your journey." "Nonsense," said Miss Marple, embracing her friend. "It was a perfectly pleasant journey, and I'm delighted to be here." They settled in the morning room, where tea had been laid out with care. Miss Marple took note of the fine china, the fresh flowers, and the way the light streamed through the tall windows. "You're looking well, Lydia," Miss Marple said. A small understatement, but one did not burden old friends with worries too quickly. "Well enough," said Mrs. Markham, waving her hand dismissively. "The house is too large for me now, of course. My husband's been gone these 15 years, and I rattle about in it like a pea in a drum. But I have good staff, and my niece, Eleanor, has been staying with me. She's a great comfort." "That must be pleasant for you," said Miss Marple. "Indeed, Eleanor is my late brother's daughter. She's 26 now, sensible on the whole, though perhaps a bit too given to romantic notions. Always reading poetry, sketching plants. She returned from London last month, full of enthusiasm about botanical societies and rare specimens." Mrs. Markham smiled indulgently. "Young people have their enthusiasms, don't they?" Miss Marple gave a small sound of agreement. In her experience, young people's enthusiasms often led to unexpected developments, though not always the kind one might hope for. After tea, Mrs. Markham suggested a walk in the gardens. Despite her rheumatism, she seemed eager to show Miss Marple the grounds. They strolled through the formal gardens, and Miss Marple remarked on a particularly fine display of delphiniums. "That's Hardwick's doing," Mrs. Markham said. "He's been our gardener for over 30 years. Getting on now, but he knows every inch of these grounds." Just then, Mrs. Markham stopped abruptly, her face draining of color. She grasped Miss Marple's arm. "Jane," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look there." Miss Marple followed her gaze. At the end of the path, set into a high stone wall, stood an iron gate. It was a beautiful Victorian piece, with intricate scroll work and leaf patterns. But it was the fact that it stood open that caught Mrs. Markham's attention. "Is something wrong, Lydia?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but concerned. "That gate," Mrs. Markham whispered. "It hasn't been opened in 30 years. It leads to the old back garden. We locked it after the accident." Miss Marple waited, her patience as always, the key to unlocking hidden truths. Mrs. Markham continued, "My husband's mother, she fell there, the old stone paths. One evening she went in alone. We found her the next morning. The doctor said she'd struck her head. After that, my husband said the garden was to be locked. The key was put away, and no one has touched it since." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And where is the key kept?" "In my husband's study, in the desk drawer. I've never moved it." The two women approached the gate. Miss Marple observed the lock carefully, noting the old hinges and signs of recent movement. There were footprints nearby, fresh and visible despite the age of the gate. "Has anyone been here this morning?" Miss Marple asked. "No one. I came this way after breakfast, and the gate was closed then. I'm sure of it." Miss Marple knelt to examine the ground more closely. "How very interesting," she murmured. A footstep behind them made both women turn. An elderly man was approaching, carrying a pair of shears and wearing a leather apron. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he said, addressing Mrs. Markham. "I saw you standing here and wondered if something's amiss." "Hardwick," said Mrs. Markham. "The gate is open." The old gardener's eyes widened, and he came forward slowly, staring at the open gate as though it were an impossible anomaly. "That's not right," he said finally. "That gate's been locked since the old master's time." "I see," said Miss Marple, her mind already piecing together the small clues. The afternoon passed quietly at Meadowbrook House. Miss Marple unpacked her modest belongings in the comfortable guest room prepared for her. The room, though simple, was charming with fresh flowers on the dresser and windows that overlooked the side garden. From this vantage point, she could see the high stone wall that enclosed the mysterious back garden, though the gate itself was obscured by a stand of laurels. At 4 o'clock, tea was served in the drawing room, and Miss Marple was joined by Eleanor. The young woman appeared distracted, though her manners remained polite. She stirred her tea absently, seemingly lost in her thoughts. Twice, she failed to respond when Mrs. Markham spoke to her. "Eleanor has been working on botanical drawings," Mrs. Markham explained with an indulgent tone. "Quite talented, actually." "How interesting," said Miss Marple. "I'm fond of gardens myself, though my sketching abilities are sadly limited. Do you draw from life, my dear, or from specimens?" "Both," said Eleanor, shaking herself from her distraction. "I've been cataloguing the plants in the outer gardens. Some quite unusual varieties, actually. Aunt Lydia's late mother-in-law was evidently very interested in rare specimens." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, noticing that Eleanor seemed a little too absorbed in her own thoughts. She had the air of someone hiding something, or at least suppressing something they didn't want to discuss. After tea, Eleanor excused herself, claiming she wanted to take a walk before dinner. "I find the evening light is beautiful for sketching," she said, but Miss Marple noticed the hurried way in which the girl left. Mrs. Markham sighed after Eleanor departed. "She's been restless lately. Ever since her trip to London, she's seemed distracted, as if something is on her mind." "Young people often have things on their minds that they prefer not to discuss," Miss Marple said gently. "I remember my niece going through a phase of great secretiveness. It turned out she was learning to ride a bicycle and didn't want anyone to know until she'd mastered it." Mrs. Markham smiled at the memory. "Yes, I suppose that's true. but I can't imagine what Eleanor might be keeping secret. She's always been such an open child. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Openness in childhood doesn't always persist. Into adulthood, people learn as they grow that some things are better kept to oneself. Later that evening, Miss Marple retired to her room, claiming a slight headache, though in truth she felt perfectly well. She had simply grown accustomed to being left alone when she feigned fatigue. As she sat by the window, her mind wandered back to the open gate and the strange happenings surrounding it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Eleanor, who appeared at the door, looking pale. "I saw the light," she said. "The light?" Miss Marple repeated, leaning forward with interest. "Yes, it was in the back garden," Eleanor explained. "It was a faint golden glow, as if someone were walking through the overgrown paths with a lantern." Miss Marple's mind raced. It had been only a few days since she had seen that same glow herself, moving slowly through the garden. "How odd," said Miss Marple quietly. "And you're sure no one else saw it?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, I was the only one. I thought it was strange, but I didn't know who else to ask." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Perhaps we should inform the constable, just in case." "Yes, of course," Eleanor agreed, though Miss Marple could sense the uncertainty in her voice. The constable arrived shortly, his presence reassuring. "I'll take a look at the gate and the garden," he said, though he appeared skeptical. "Probably just some village lads playing pranks. They like to target old places like these. There's talk of the garden being haunted, you know." "Haunted?" Miss Marple inquired with mild interest. "Oh, yes, miss," the constable confirmed. "There's been talk for years about the old garden being cursed, what with the stories of Mrs. Markham's late mother-in-law's death. It's all nonsense, of course." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, I'm sure it is." After the constable left, promising to return in the morning, the household retired for the evening. But Miss Marple could not shake the thought of the strange light. The next morning, as was her habit, Miss Marple woke early. The sun had only just begun to break through the mist, casting pale light over the gardens. She went downstairs to find the house still and quiet, and helped herself to tea from the sideboard in the morning room. As she stood by the window, observing the path leading toward the mysterious back garden, she thought about Eleanor. The young woman had shown some unusual behavior the previous evening. Could she be hiding something? Had she been involved in the mystery of the open gate and the strange glow in the garden? She was lost in thought when Mrs. Markham entered, her face drawn with anxiety. "Jane," she said urgently, "have you seen Eleanor this morning?" "No," Miss Marple replied. "I've just come downstairs. Is something wrong?" "I can't find her," Mrs. Markham confessed, her voice trembling. "Her bed hasn't been slept in. The covers are pulled back, but in a way that suggests she just left, without making the bed. Her robe's still on the hook." Miss Marple placed her teacup down carefully. "Has anyone checked the grounds?" "I rang for Hardwick. He should be here soon," Mrs. Markham replied. Hardwick arrived shortly, and Miss Marple could tell from his expression that something was amiss. "There's something you should see," Hardwick said gravely, leading them toward the back garden. As they approached the gate, Miss Marple noted a pair of women's shoes neatly placed by the edge of the garden path. She recognized them immediately as Eleanor's. They were light summer shoes, impractical for walking in the garden, and they bore fresh earth on the soles. "Dear God," whispered Mrs. Markham. Miss Marple bent to examine the shoes. "They've been placed deliberately," she noted. "Not dropped, but set down as though their owner meant to continue on without them." Hardwick pointed to a thorn bush nearby. "There's something else, miss." He indicated a scrap of fabric caught on one of the thorns. Miss Marple carefully extracted the scrap, recognizing it as part of Eleanor's shawl. "It seems she was here," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Markham's voice trembled. "We must open the gate. She may be in there, hurt or lost." Miss Marple considered for a moment before speaking. Yes, but first, I think we should inform Constable Miller. The constable arrived with his usual methodical approach. He tried the lock and found it secure. He examined the grounds, but found no clear signs of entry. "I'll come back in the morning and look again," he said. "Probably just a prank." Miss Marple wasn't convinced. She felt an underlying tension, an almost palpable sense of urgency in the air. Eleanor's disappearance seemed to be part of something much larger. Later that evening, Miss Marple retired to her room, but her mind was still occupied with the mystery. She spent hours mulling over the clues, observing every subtle detail, trying to form a clearer picture of what had occurred. The next morning, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a dark coat approached her, and though his face was unfamiliar, his presence stirred a sense of familiarity. It was Mr. Carroll, the botanical scholar from London who had been so interested in Meadowbrook House's garden. Miss Marple was sitting quietly by the window in the morning room when the man entered. His tall figure cast a shadow across the floor, and Miss Marple, with her usual attention to detail, studied him closely. He was well dressed, with a tall, wide-brimmed hat and a sharp, intelligent look. There was something about him that felt out of place, a certain air of arrogance that Miss Marple recognized immediately. He introduced himself as Mr. Carroll, a botanical scholar from London who had shown interest in the rare plants of the old garden. Miss Marple had already heard of him from Mrs. Hobson, the herb shop owner, and now here he was, standing before her as though he belonged. "Miss Marple," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I understand you are staying at Meadowbrook House. I've heard much about the garden here and the valuable specimens it might contain." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Indeed, the garden holds many secrets, but I wonder, Mr. Carroll, why you are so interested in it, considering its long-standing neglect." Mr. Carroll chuckled lightly, though there was something hollow about his laugh. "Ah, but that is the appeal, isn't it? A garden untouched for so many years, hiding treasures that could be of great interest to the right people." Miss Marple regarded him quietly for a moment. "You believe there are treasures here, then?" "Of course," he replied. "The Queen's breath, for example. A rare plant, nearly extinct and possibly still growing in this very garden. Imagine the discovery of such a specimen." Miss Marple felt a shift in the air, a subtle change in his tone. There was something almost predatory in his eagerness. She had learned long ago that people like him, those who sought out things others had long abandoned, often hid motives that were less than pure. "I imagine it would be quite valuable," Miss Marple said, her voice calm and measured. "But why involve Eleanor in this?" Mr. Carroll stiffened at the mention of Eleanor's name. "Miss Markham. She's a young woman of considerable interest to the botanical community. She had some very good knowledge of rare plants, and I thought we could help each other." Miss Marple's eyes never left his face. "I'm sure you did, but I also think you've been exploiting her interest in these plants for your own gain." The silence between them thickened, but Mr. Carroll didn't break it. Instead, he gave her a curt nod. "I think you are mistaken, Miss Marple. I had no such intentions." Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her sharp mind already piecing things together. "Then why would Eleanor be missing? And why would you have fled the village so suddenly?" Carroll's eyes flickered, betraying a brief flash of something. Perhaps guilt, perhaps fear. He recovered quickly, though, and turned to leave. "I've said all I intend to say, Miss Marple," he said coldly. "Good day." Miss Marple watched him leave, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. His response had confirmed what she suspected. He knew more than he was letting on, and she was certain that whatever he was hiding was connected to Eleanor's disappearance. Miss Marple had already made up her mind that a more thorough search of the garden was necessary. The garden, though seemingly abandoned, was a treasure trove of clues if one knew where to look. The next day, after breakfast, Miss Marple set out once again for the garden. Mrs. Markham had stayed in, but Miss Marple was certain the answers lay beyond the locked gates. The overgrown paths, the tangled rose bushes, and the scattered foxgloves all seemed to hold secrets waiting to be uncovered. As she walked through the thick foliage, she noticed something curious, a trail of footprints leading toward a particularly dense part of the garden. The prints were unmistakable. Eleanor's small, narrow steps leading up to the old stone bird bath. Miss Marple knelt beside it, noticing that the earth had been disturbed recently. Someone had been digging, and they had been in quite a hurry. The footprints led around the bird bath, and Miss Marple followed them with care. There, in a quiet corner of the garden, she found something of interest. A small patch of earth had been dug up, and the soil had been freshly turned. She crouched low and examined the ground more closely, her eyes narrowing as she noticed something gleaming faintly beneath the soil. Carefully, she used her walking stick to scrape away the dirt, revealing a small leather pouch. Miss Marple opened it slowly, revealing several items: gardening tools, a small bundle of notes, and a single silver token. The token was embossed with the Royal Horticultural Society's emblem, and Miss Marple's heart gave a small lurch. She recognized it immediately. "Eleanor," she murmured. The silver token was significant, far more than a mere piece of decoration. It confirmed that someone had been in the garden recently, someone with the knowledge and the means to access the rare plants that had been hidden there for so long. As Miss Marple straightened up, she thought back to her earlier conversation with Mr. Carroll. The token must have belonged to him, or perhaps to someone he had been working with. But what did it mean? And how did it tie into Eleanor's disappearance? With the discovery of the token, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Eleanor. The young woman had been involved in something far deeper than mere botanical curiosity. She had known the risks, perhaps even understood the consequences, but had she been manipulated into a position she couldn't escape? It was time to speak with Mrs. Markham again. Miss Marple approached her in the sitting room, where she was reading by the window. "I found something," Miss Marple said, drawing out the silver token and placing it on the table. This token was buried in the garden, near the old bird bath. Mrs. Markham's face paled as she looked at the emblem. That belongs to Mr. Carroll. I saw him wear one at that lecture in London." Miss Marple nodded. "And now he's gone and Eleanor is missing. I think Mr. Carroll was after something more than just botanical discovery. He knew what was hidden in that garden, and he was determined to get it." Mrs. Markham looked at her, eyes wide with realization. Eleanor was involved in this, wasn't she? She didn't just stumble into it. She knew more than I thought. Miss Marple gave a small sigh. "She knew enough to put herself in danger, and now she's missing. But we have one lead, this token. It's a clue, and I intend to follow it." As Miss Marple spoke, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Carroll was not just a scholar. He was a man willing to exploit others to get what he wanted. And Eleanor had unwittingly become his accomplice, a pawn in his carefully constructed plan. After a brief but revealing conversation with Mrs. Hobson at the herb shop, Miss Marple learned that Carroll had been far more calculating than she had initially suspected. He had not simply stumbled upon Eleanor. He had researched her interests, cultivated a relationship, and used her enthusiasm for rare plants to gain access to Meadowbrook House's secret garden. The constable returned to the village with word that Carroll had left suddenly, his whereabouts now unknown. But Miss Marple, with her ever-sharp instincts, was not about to let him slip away unnoticed. "Mr. Carroll is not the man he pretends to be," Miss Marple mused to herself, watching the garden as it slowly gave up its secrets. "And Eleanor? Eleanor will have to tell us everything she knows." The discovery of the silver token had sparked a renewed sense of urgency in Miss Marple. She could no longer afford to wait idly for Eleanor to return. The young woman's disappearance seemed more intricately woven into the mystery of the garden than Miss Marple had initially realized. The constable had confirmed that Carol had indeed left in a hurry, but Miss Marple wasn't convinced that the answers they sought lay only with him. There was something else, something hidden deeper within the abandoned garden, something that Eleanor might have discovered, or perhaps had been trying to escape. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the overgrown rose bushes once again, the morning sunlight filtering through the tangled vines. She had already examined the area around the bird bath, but something about the roses tugged at her mind. There was more to this spot than just the unusual golden foxgloves. Eleanor had hidden her diary here. Why? Kneeling beside the rose bush where she had found Eleanor's shawl, Miss Marple dug carefully at the earth. She had seen the disturbance in the soil earlier, but now, as she sifted through the dirt, her heart raced with the feeling that something important was just beneath the surface. A few moments later, Miss Marple uncovered a small, weathered bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Carefully, she unwrapped it, revealing a small leather-bound diary. The handwriting inside was unmistakable. Eleanor's. Miss Marple sat back on her heels and began reading the entries, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed the details. The diary began with the usual enthusiasm of a young woman eager to explore her interests, but as the entries progressed, the tone shifted. There were mentions of meetings with Carol, at first seemingly innocent, but then growing more urgent. The final entry, written only days before. Miss Marple stood, clutching the diary tightly in her hands as the full gravity of Eleanor's situation settled over her. The young woman had been caught in a web of lies, manipulated by a man who had used her knowledge for his own gain. But Miss Marple had one more place to visit, Mrs. Hobson at the herb shop. When Miss Marple arrived, the shop was quiet, the air thick with the scent of dried herbs. Mrs. Hobson, a woman of keen observation, greeted her warmly, though her expression grew serious when Miss Marple mentioned the missing girl. "I've been thinking about Eleanor," Miss Marple began. "And I wonder, Mrs. Hobson, if you might recall anything unusual about Mr. Carroll's behavior the last time he came in." Mrs. Hobson paused, her brow furrowing. "Well, Miss Marple, now that you mention it, there was something strange about him. He had a particular interest in the Queen's breath plant, more than I would expect from a botanist." "Did he ask anything about Meadowbrook House?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Hobson nodded slowly. "He did, but it wasn't just casual conversation. He was keenly interested in the old garden. I told him about it, though I didn't think much of it at the time." "Did Eleanor know about this?" Miss Marple pressed. "Yes, Eleanor mentioned Carol a few times. She seemed eager to discuss her botanical research with him. But after their meeting, she became distant, as though something had changed between them." "Do you think Carol was using her?" Miss Marple asked softly. "I didn't want to believe it, but looking back, I think he might have been. Eleanor didn't just disappear. Something happened between them. Something serious." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mrs. Hobson. Your insight has been invaluable. Eleanor's disappearance was chilling. I've made a terrible mistake. Carol is not who he claims to be. I've learned the truth. He's been using me, manipulating me. He's not a scholar. He's a thief, and he plans to steal from the garden. I can't help him anymore. I must end this tonight. I will meet him at the gate, and I will tell him I'm finished. I will not be part of this any longer." Miss Marple paused, her heart heavy. Eleanor had realized the truth, but had it been too late? Had Carol threatened her into silence? Or worse, had he found a way to silence her permanently? As Miss Marple reread the entry, a feeling of dread washed over her. Eleanor had been determined to confront Carol, but had she done so? The diary's final entry suggested she was prepared to, but it did not explain what happened afterward. Miss Marple stood, clutching the diary tightly in her hands as the full gravity of Eleanor's situation settled over her. The young woman had been caught in a web of lies, manipulated by a man who had used her knowledge for his own gain. But Miss Marple had one more place to visit, Mrs. Hobson at the herb shop. When Miss Marple arrived, the shop was quiet, the air thick with the scent of dried herbs. Mrs. Hobson, a woman of keen observation, greeted her warmly, though her expression grew serious when Miss Marple mentioned the missing girl. "I've been thinking about Eleanor," Miss Marple began. "And I wonder, Mrs. Hobson, if you might recall anything unusual about Mr. Carroll's behavior the last time he came in." Mrs. Hobson paused, her brow furrowing. "Well, Miss Marple, now that you mention it, there was something strange about him. He had a particular interest in the Queen's breath plant, more than I would expect from a botanist." "Did he ask anything about Meadowbrook House?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Hobson nodded slowly. "He did. But it wasn't just casual conversation. He was keenly interested in the old garden. I told him about it, though I didn't think much of it at the time." "Did Eleanor know about this?" Miss Marple pressed. "Yes, Eleanor mentioned Carroll a few times. She seemed eager to discuss her botanical research with him, but after their meeting she became distant, as though something had changed between them." "Do you think Carroll was using her?" Miss Marple asked softly. "I didn't want to believe it, but looking back, I think he might have been. Eleanor didn't just disappear. Something happened between them, something serious." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mrs. Hobson. Your insight has been invaluable." With the diary's revelations and the new information from Mrs. Hobson, Miss Marple was certain that Carroll had been involved in more than just a botanical venture. He had been using Eleanor for access to the rare plants in the garden, plants that could fetch a high price in the right circles. But what had gone wrong? Why had Eleanor disappeared so suddenly? Miss Marple returned to Meadowbrook House, her mind working through the puzzle. She had already visited the garden, and though she had found some clues, there was one area she had not yet fully explored: the old well. The well, she remembered, had been mentioned in the diary. Eleanor had fallen into it after her confrontation with Carroll. It was time to investigate. When Miss Marple arrived at the well, she found the area still disturbed. The grating that once covered it had been moved, and the earth around it had been disturbed as though someone had been searching for something. She knelt beside the well and peered inside. The darkness seemed endless, but there was something down there, a faint glimmer of something metallic. "Constable," she called, "I need your help." The constable hurried over, followed by a few men from the village. Together, they lowered a lantern into the well, revealing a narrow ledge where something or someone had clearly been. With great care, they lowered a rope, and within moments, they had secured it to Miss Marple's waist. She descended slowly, using the rope to guide herself until she finally reached the ledge. And there, lying unconscious but alive, was Eleanor Markham. Eleanor was carefully brought back to the surface and rushed to her room, where the doctor attended to her. She was weak but otherwise unharmed. When Miss Marple spoke with her, Eleanor was understandably shaken, but grateful for the rescue. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she confessed. "I thought I could help him. Carroll seemed so knowledgeable. But then I realized what he was doing. He wasn't interested in saving the plants. He was stealing them." "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Miss Marple asked gently. Eleanor lowered her gaze. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do. And when I confronted him, he became threatening. I thought I could get away from him, but then I fell into the well. I thought I would die down there." Miss Marple smiled softly. "You are very brave, my dear. And now it seems the mystery has come to a close. Carroll will face justice for his crimes." In the weeks that followed, Meadowbrook House's garden was restored. Eleanor, now fully recovered, helped oversee the work, ensuring that the rare plants were preserved and cared for. The old garden, once a place of mystery and intrigue, was now a symbol of resilience and renewal. Miss Marple, having solved the case, returned to St. Mary Mead, content in the knowledge that justice had been served. And though the enchanted garden had revealed its secrets, Miss Marple knew that some mysteries like the human heart, would remain forever unsolved. Miss Marple had returned to St. Mary Mead, but the case of the enchanted garden remained in her thoughts. She had solved the mystery of Eleanor's disappearance and the deceitful schemes of Mr. Carroll, but there was still one lingering question. What had truly driven Carroll to such desperation? It was a few days later, as Miss Marple was enjoying her afternoon tea, when a familiar knock echoed at her door. She opened it to find Constable Miller holding an envelope in his hand. "Miss Marple, I thought you'd like to know," he began, handing her the letter. "We've found something that may provide some further answers about Mr. Carroll." Miss Marple opened the envelope, her keen eyes scanning the contents. It was a letter from the London police. "They've found a lead," Constable Miller continued. Mr. Carroll had been connected to a few other cases in the area, though he used several aliases. It seems he had been running a smuggling operation, trafficking rare plants to wealthy collectors under the guise of a botanical research project. Miss Marple's eyes widened. So he wasn't simply a thief. He was part of a much larger, more organized scheme. This garden wasn't just a treasure trove for him, it was a part of a network of stolen plants. "Exactly," said Constable Miller. "It appears that the garden at Meadowbrook House was just one of many places he targeted. He had been collecting rare species from all over the country, and with Eleanor's help, he was able to access Meadowbrook House without raising suspicion." Miss Marple folded the letter thoughtfully. So Carroll's interest in Eleanor was no accident. He saw an opportunity in her knowledge of plants, particularly the rare species cultivated in the old garden. The constable nodded grimly. "And it seems he planned to sell them to the highest bidder. His arrest in London was just the tip of the iceberg. We're now investigating several other smuggling rings linked to botanical theft." Miss Marple's expression softened as she thought of Eleanor, who had been so eager to make a difference in the world of botany. Her naivety had almost cost her everything, but she had shown remarkable resilience in the end. "I'm glad that we were able to put an end to Carroll's scheme," Miss Marple mused. "But it's tragic that someone so young had to be involved in such a dangerous enterprise. Eleanor's future will be very different now. I hope that she learns from this experience and continues her love for plants, but with a much more cautious heart." The constable smiled faintly. "She'll be all right, Miss Marple. Thanks to your sharp eye, we were able to piece together the whole story. I doubt she'll ever make the same mistake again." Weeks passed, and the garden at Meadowbrook House continued to be restored. Eleanor, having come to terms with the truth about Mr. Carroll, poured herself into the project of preserving her family's botanical legacy. Mrs. Markham, though still grieving the loss of her late husband, found solace in the garden's return to life. "Perhaps this is the real purpose of the garden," she said to Miss Marple one afternoon, "to remind us that even in the darkest times, there is always a chance for renewal." Miss Marple smiled, watching as the once overgrown rose bushes bloomed in the spring sun. "Indeed, Lydia, gardens have a way of offering hope to those who care for them. They teach us patience, resilience, and the power of time to heal all things." Eleanor joined Miss Marple one afternoon, her face brighter than it had been in months. "I wanted to thank you," Eleanor said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I never would have believed I could be so foolish, but you showed me the way forward. I can't undo the mistakes I've made, but I can learn from them." "You have shown great strength, Eleanor," Miss Marple replied gently. "It's not the mistakes we make that define us, but how we choose to move forward from them." The two women walked side by side through the garden, admiring the flowers and the plants that were beginning to bloom once again. The golden foxgloves, once hidden and thought lost, had returned, their delicate flowers standing proudly among the common varieties. It was a fitting metaphor for Eleanor herself, once a girl lost in confusion, now standing tall and strong. Months passed, and Eleanor Markham's life gradually returned to a new normal. She continued to work with the garden, but this time with a focus on conservation and education. The rare plants that had once been a source of danger were now carefully preserved, their true value recognized and respected. Miss Marple, as she always did after solving a case, returned to her quiet life in St. Mary Mead. The garden at Meadowbrook House was no longer a place of secrets, but of growth and renewal. Though the mystery of the enchanted garden had been solved, Miss Marple knew that, in life, there would always be new puzzles to unravel, new mysteries to uncover. But for now, she could rest easy, knowing that justice had been served, and that a young woman had been given a second chance. And so, as she sipped her tea by the window in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple smiled to herself, content in the knowledge that some mysteries, though dark and twisted, could still lead to the light of truth. As the months unfolded, news of the recovery of the rare plants from the old garden at Meadowbrook House spread through the local community. Eleanor's efforts to restore the garden had not only brought peace to the Markham family, but had also garnered the admiration of many in the world of horticulture. Eleanor had become an advocate for responsible conservation, dedicating herself to preserving rare species rather than exploiting them for profit. But it wasn't just the garden that had transformed. Eleanor herself had grown stronger, more confident, and, with time, more at peace with her past. She had written a letter to Miss Marple a few months after the incident, thanking her once more for everything she had done, and Miss Marple had read it with quiet satisfaction. Eleanor had come to understand her role in the world and the mistakes she had made, and was determined to never make the same errors again. Still, in the back of Miss Marple's mind, the mystery of Carol's true motivations lingered. While Carol had been arrested and was facing charges in London for his involvement in the smuggling ring, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story than met the eye. It was a crisp autumn morning when Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. The knock on her door was soft but insistent. When she opened it, standing on her doorstep was a familiar face. A face she hadn't seen in months. "Miss Marple," said Constable Miller, his voice grave. "There's something I think you should see." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "What is it, Constable?" "It's about Carol. We've dug a bit deeper into his past, his associates, his ties to other criminal activities, and we found something troubling." Miss Marple nodded, intrigued but not surprised. She had suspected there was more to Carol than met the eye, but she had been focused on the case with Eleanor, not thinking of the broader picture. "What exactly did you uncover?" "We found another letter, Miss Marple. Not one he sent, but one he received. It was in his belongings when he was arrested. It seems he was involved in something even darker than we realized." Miss Marple invited Constable Miller inside, motioning for him to sit. She took her own seat, adjusting her glasses. "Please, Constable, tell me everything." Constable Miller unrolled a letter from a thick envelope and handed it to Miss Marple. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and the handwriting was unfamiliar, yet unmistakably formal. "It seems," Miller explained, "that Carol had been corresponding with someone connected to an organization tied to rare plant trading, and a larger smuggling ring that spanned several continents." Miss Marple read the letter with careful attention. The words were precise, and the tone was businesslike, almost academic. The letter was signed by someone named Dr. Alistair Wren, a name Miss Marple did not recognize. She read on. "Your interest in the Queen's Breath specimen is noted. We are in the final stages of our acquisition of the rarest species known to us. The old garden at Meadowbrook House remains the only undiscovered location, and we will need your expertise to guide us to it. Your arrangement with Miss Eleanor Markham has been observed, and it is crucial that you proceed with caution. If the situation escalates, we will not be able to guarantee your safety or the success of this acquisition." The letter was unsettling. Miss Marple's brow furrowed as she absorbed the details. Dr. Wren seemed to be a key figure behind the operation, and it was clear that Carol's interest in the plants at Meadowbrook House had been more than just a personal project. It was part of a larger, more dangerous scheme. "Do you have any leads on Dr. Wren?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but filled with urgency. "We've traced the letter back to a small botanical society in London, but nothing conclusive. We're still working on it," Constable Miller replied, his tone tinged with frustration. Miss Marple placed the letter down on the table, her mind already racing through possibilities. This organization, this Dr. Wren, could be the key to understanding Carol's true motives, she said softly. Miss Marple spent the next few days quietly reflecting on the information she had learned. It was clear that Carol had been part of something larger, something that had not only exploited Eleanor's trust, but had been using her to gain access to the garden for its rare plants. But Dr. Wren, the name behind it all, was still a mystery. Miss Marple's first instinct was to visit the Botanical Society in London. If there was anyone who could provide insight into Dr. Wren's connections, it would be the people in that world. But she knew she needed to proceed with caution. This was no longer just about rare plants. It was about criminal networks operating under the guise of academic interest. Meanwhile, Eleanor had resumed her work in the garden, but with a newfound focus on preserving rather than exploiting the plants. Mrs. Markham continued to oversee the restoration of the property, ensuring that it would become a place of education and public enjoyment rather than the dark secret it had once been. As Miss Marple sat by her window one evening, reflecting on the case, a sudden thought occurred to her. Carol had taken great care to conceal his involvement in the larger criminal network, and even now, with his arrest, they hadn't uncovered the full extent of his operations. "I think," Miss Marple said to herself, "there's still more to this story, more than we realize." It was a month later when Miss Marple received the final piece of the puzzle. Constable Miller arrived at her home, this time with a look of resolve in his eyes. "We've found Dr. Wren," he said, handing Miss Marple a file with a photograph. The man in the photograph was older, with a scholarly appearance, thin, with sharp features and a meticulously groomed beard. His eyes, however, were cold and calculating. "Dr. Alistair Wren," Miller explained. "He's been operating under the radar for years, moving from one society to another, always targeting rare species for trade. But we finally managed to track him down. It appears he was working with Carol to steal the rarest specimens from private gardens, using their academic facade to mask his true intentions." Miss Marple examined the photo closely, her mind already processing the implications. "And what will be done with him now?" "He's been arrested, Miss Marple. His network is unraveling as we speak. We've linked him to several other thefts, and we're confident we'll be able to charge him for everything, including his involvement with Carol." Dr. Wren's arrest marked the end of a dangerous operation that had spanned across Europe, but for Eleanor, the true healing had only just begun. With the help of the botanical community, Eleanor had turned the garden at Meadowbrook House into a sanctuary for endangered species and a symbol of hope for those who sought to preserve the natural world rather than exploit it. Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, continued to watch from afar as the garden flourished. She was content, knowing that justice had been served and that the true beauty of the garden had been restored, not just to the Markham family, but to the world. And though Miss Marple had uncovered the last of the secrets, there was a part of her that knew another mystery was always waiting just around the corner. For in the world of gardens, as in life, there were always more secrets to uncover. But for now, as the sun set over the blooming roses and golden foxgloves, Miss Marple was at peace, content in the knowledge that the enchanted garden had finally revealed its secrets. Life in St. Mary Mead had returned to its quiet rhythm. The seasons changed, the flowers bloomed and faded, and Miss Marple resumed her routine of tending to her garden and observing the comings and goings of the local villagers. Yet, despite the peaceful setting, Miss Marple's sharp mind never ceased its quiet work. One afternoon, as she sat on a bench in her garden enjoying the late spring breeze, a familiar figure approached, It was Mrs. Markham, looking more relaxed than she had in months. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Markham greeted warmly, sitting beside her. "I thought I'd come by and share some good news with you." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm always happy to hear good news, Lydia. What's on your mind?" "It's about the garden," Mrs. Markham began. "Eleanor and I have decided to open it to the public. We've worked so hard to restore it, and now we want others to appreciate it too. The flowers, the plants, they're not just for us anymore. They belong to everyone." Miss Marple nodded, pleased with the decision. "That sounds like a wonderful idea. The garden has indeed become a place of healing, not only for you and Eleanor, but for the community as well. It's a fitting tribute to your family's history. And to the memory of my late husband," Mrs. Markham added quietly. "It's strange, isn't it, how something so beautiful can come from something so painful. It seems like a lesson in resilience, in making the best of what we're given." Miss Marple studied the older woman for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I believe you're right, Lydia. Gardens have a way of teaching us patience and renewal. They remind us that no matter how dark things may seem, life continues to grow and flourish." Mrs. Markham smiled. "Eleanor has taken on a new role as well. She's been invited to speak at several botanical societies, sharing her knowledge and experiences with others. It's been such a positive change for her." "I'm glad to hear that," Miss Marple said. "She's a bright young woman, and she deserves a future filled with promise." As they talked, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. The mystery of the enchanted garden had been solved, but its legacy was just beginning. Eleanor, once a victim of manipulation, had turned her experience into a source of strength. She was no longer the naive young woman who had been swept up in a dangerous scheme, but a capable and confident individual ready to contribute to the world. It was a few weeks later when Miss Marple received a letter from Eleanor inviting her to a special event at Meadowbrook House, the grand opening of the restored garden. The letter was warm and full of gratitude, and Miss Marple felt a sense of pride as she read it. On the day of the event, Miss Marple arrived at Meadowbrook House to find the garden filled with visitors. There were local villagers, scholars, and gardening enthusiasts all gathered to admire the fruits of Eleanor's labor. The garden was indeed a marvel, its once neglected paths now full of life, with rare plants thriving in every corner. Eleanor was there, greeting guests and showing them around with a newfound grace and confidence. She spotted Miss Marple and made her way over, her face lighting up with a smile. "Miss Marple, I'm so glad you could make it," Eleanor exclaimed, her voice full of warmth. "This garden, I don't know what I would have done without you." Miss Marple smiled softly, her eyes twinkling with quiet wisdom. "You've done all of this, Eleanor. You've taken something dark and made it light again. That takes strength and courage." Eleanor blushed, a hint of modesty in her gaze. "I couldn't have done it without you, Miss Marple. You saw the truth when no one else could. You helped me find my way." The two women stood together for a moment, watching as people wandered through the garden, admiring the flowers and the rare plants. Miss Marple's mind wandered back to the events that had led them here. The dark days when the garden had been a place of mystery and danger, and how far they had come since then. The garden, now full of life and light, was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It was a place where the past and present met, where secrets were unearthed and truths revealed. It had been transformed from a site of fear and manipulation into a place of renewal and hope. As Miss Marple and Eleanor spoke, a sudden breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, and the scent of roses and lavender filled the air. The golden foxgloves, once hidden among the overgrowth, now stood tall and proud in the sunlight. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Some mysteries, she thought, are meant to be solved, but others, like the garden, are meant to grow. In the months that followed, the garden at Meadowbrook House continued to thrive. Eleanor Markham became known as a leading voice in the world of botanical conservation. her work inspiring others to preserve the world's rarest species. The garden was open to the public regularly, attracting visitors from near and far. And for Miss Marple, life in St. Mary Mead carried on as it always had. Quiet, peaceful, and full of the subtle rhythms that made the village so special. Yet, in the back of her mind, she knew that there would always be another mystery to solve, another story to uncover. But for now, she could rest easy. The enchanted garden had revealed its secrets, and in doing so, had given Eleanor the chance to start anew. And Miss Marple, the quiet observer, would always be there, watching, waiting for the next enigma to unfold. Miss Marple had always believed that, in life, the most important truths were often the ones left unspoken. She had learned over the years that it was the subtle shifts in a person's demeanor, the quiet pauses between words, and the unasked questions that often held the most profound answers. The garden at Meadowbrook House had flourished, but the deeper currents of life in St. Mary Mead were always shifting quietly in the background. Miss Marple often found herself reflecting on these currents, on the small mysteries that unfolded without notice, often with far-reaching consequences. One day, several months after the grand opening of the garden, Miss Marple was sitting by her window, the soft rays of the late autumn sun casting long shadows across her sitting room. Her knitting rested in her lap as she gazed out over her garden, her mind once again drifting toward Eleanor and the garden at Meadowbrook House. The sound of a soft knock on her door broke her reverie. She rose slowly, her joints creaking in protest, but her mind sharp and alert. When she opened the door, standing there was none other than Lydia Markham. Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Lydia, how lovely to see you. Please come in." Lydia entered, her usual composed demeanor slightly strained, as though something weighed heavily on her mind. She didn't take a seat immediately, but instead walked over to the window and gazed out at Miss Marple's well-tended garden. "I'm sorry to trouble you, Jane," Lydia began, her voice quiet but tinged with an uncharacteristic nervousness. "But I've come to ask for your advice. Something odd has been happening, something that I can't quite explain." Miss Marple's interest piqued, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Of course, Lydia. I'm happy to help. What's troubling you?" Lydia hesitated for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. She turned toward Miss Marple, her expression somber. "It's about the garden again. And Eleanor." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. She had seen Lydia in many moods over the years, but there was a certain unease in her manner today that Miss Marple could not ignore. "Eleanor?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "Has something happened to her?" Lydia shook her head, her face drawn. No, it's not that. Eleanor is fine physically. It's just..." She paused again, choosing her words carefully. "Eleanor has become, well, obsessed. It started a few weeks ago. She's been spending all of her time at Meadowbrook House, working on the garden, more than usual even. But now she seems distracted. She's been acting strangely, withdrawn, and she's made some odd comments. I'm worried, Jane. I don't know how to help her." Miss Marple observed Lydia with an intensity that was almost imperceptible, but she noticed the slight tremor in Lydia's hands. Her gaze softened, and she gently took Lydia's hand in her own. "Tell me, Lydia, what exactly has Eleanor said or done that has made you so concerned?" Lydia took a deep breath, as though steeling herself to explain. "It's the garden, Jane. Eleanor has become obsessed with it in ways I can't understand. She spends entire days there, even at night. She says she's trying to uncover something, but I don't know what. She's been talking about hidden things in the garden, about the history of the plants there. She even mentioned that something remained in the garden, something left behind." Lydia's voice faltered. "She's acting as though the garden holds secrets that no one else can see." Miss Marple's mind began to race. There were still questions that lingered about the garden at Meadowbrook House, unanswered threads that had been left dangling. She'd assumed that after Mr. Carroll's arrest and the garden's restoration, the secrets of Meadowbrook House had been revealed. But now, it seemed, a new mystery was stirring. Did she say anything specific about these secrets? Miss Marple asked gently, though her mind was already considering the possibilities. Lydia nodded, her face pale. She said something strange the other day. She told me that the garden never forgets, that it had a memory, that it held on to something from the past. Miss Marple's mind sharpened. A memory. What could Eleanor have meant by that? Had she unearthed something hidden beneath the overgrown flowers and shrubs? Or perhaps there was something she had missed, something that had eluded even Miss Marple's perceptive eye. Lydia, I think it's time I paid another visit to Meadowbrook House, Miss Marple said quietly, her tone firm. There are things about the garden that we may still not fully understand. I'll speak with Eleanor. We'll get to the bottom of this together. The following day, Miss Marple made her way to Meadowbrook House, her heart heavy with the anticipation of what might lie ahead. Lydia's concerns had been unsettling, and as she walked through the familiar village roads, she couldn't shake the feeling that the garden had more to reveal. Upon her arrival, she was greeted by the familiar sight of Meadowbrook House's grand facade, its Georgian architecture still as elegant as ever. But it was the garden that Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to. The once thriving space now seemed even more alive, the flowers blooming vibrantly as though the garden itself had embraced its own revival. She was led into the house by one of the servants, who ushered her toward the drawing room where Lydia was waiting. But it wasn't just Lydia who sat there. Eleanor was by her side, her face pale, her eyes distant. Miss Marple, I'm glad you've come, Lydia said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and worry. Eleanor has been telling me about the garden. I think it's time you spoke with her. Eleanor looked up as Miss Marple entered the room, her gaze flickering briefly with recognition. But there was something cold in her eyes, something that Miss Marple had not seen before. Eleanor, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, sitting beside her. Your aunt is very concerned. I'm concerned too. What's been happening? What have you discovered in the garden? For a moment, there was silence. Eleanor's lips parted as though she were about to speak, but she hesitated, as if something was holding her back. Finally, her voice broke the silence, low and trembling. I found something buried in the garden. I didn't know at first what it was, but when I started digging, I realized. She looked up at Miss Marple, her face filled with confusion. It's a chest, Miss Marple, a small wooden chest, and inside there are papers, old, yellowed, and written in a language I don't understand. Miss Marple's heart quickened. A chest? What could it be? Had it been there all along, hidden beneath the roots and flowers of the garden? I need to show you, Eleanor whispered, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. I thought it was just an old family relic. But it's not. It's something more. Miss Marple followed Eleanor into the garden, her thoughts a whirl of possibilities. As they approached the spot where Eleanor had been digging, Miss Marple noticed that the ground had been freshly disturbed. Eleanor carefully moved aside the overgrown vines and flowers, revealing the partially exposed chest. It was small, no more than 2 feet long, and covered in thick layers of soil and moss. It seemed ancient, worn by time, yet there was something about it, something oddly familiar. With Eleanor's help, Miss Marple gently pried open the chest. Inside were bundles of old papers, maps and books, all carefully wrapped in faded cloth. But what caught Miss Marple's eye immediately was a small tarnished medallion lying atop the papers. It had the emblem of the Royal Horticultural Society engraved on it, the same symbol Miss Marple had seen on the silver token that had been found in the bird bath so many months ago. Her heart raced as she picked up the medallion, feeling the weight of the mystery pressing in on her. This chest, hidden for so many years, contained secrets. Secrets connected to Dr. Wren, to Carol, and perhaps even to the garden itself. This is the answer, Miss Marple whispered to herself. Miss Marple held the tarnished medallion in her hand, her fingers brushing over its intricate design. The emblem of the Royal Horticultural Society was unmistakable, but the sensation she felt as she examined it, like an old door creaking open, made her shiver. Something deeper lay beneath the surface of the garden's history, something hidden for far too long. Eleanor, standing beside her, watched Miss Marple with wide eyes, her breath catching. "What does it mean, Miss Marple? Why is this here?" Miss Marple turned the medallion over, feeling its weight and studying the faint marks on its back. Her voice was steady, but her mind raced. This medallion was likely awarded to someone for their contributions to botanical preservation, she murmured, her thoughts already going back to the pieces of the puzzle she had uncovered. But I suspect it's far more than just a simple award. Eleanor's gaze flickered nervously toward the chest, then back at Miss Marple. "What are you thinking? Is this tied to the garden's past?" "I believe it is," Miss Marple said, looking up at the high stone wall of the garden, which had been a silent witness to so much. She glanced back at the chest. The chest may have been hidden deliberately, perhaps by someone who wanted to keep its contents out of sight for a very long time. The Royal Horticultural Society's emblem suggests this chest might have been connected to an influential figure from the past, someone who was more than just a gardener. She reached into the chest and began to carefully unfold the old papers wrapped in faded cloth. The musty smell of aged parchment filled the air as she examined them one by one. Maps of the garden, sketches of plants, and pages of botanical research. One page caught her eye. It was a journal entry, written in a precise, flowing script. March 1st, 1865. The Queen's breath is finally flowering in the secret garden. I have decided to hide it here, away from prying eyes. The others must never know about it. Its value is greater than they can imagine. Only when the right moment arrives will it be shared. The handwriting was unmistakably that of Mrs. Markham's late mother-in-law, who had spent her life cultivating rare plants. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as she pieced together the implications. The Queen's breath plant was not just a rare species, it was a treasure, hidden away deliberately, and for a reason that seemed tied to something far more sinister. Miss Marple closed the journal carefully, her mind still processing the information. "The plant was hidden here, as a secret," she murmured. "Mrs. Markham's mother-in-law must have known its true value long before anyone else. She went to great lengths to keep it concealed." Eleanor frowned, her voice shaking. "You mean, Carol was right to be so obsessed with the garden? He knew about the plant all along?" Miss Marple's eyes hardened. "Yes, Eleanor. But Carol didn't just want to steal a rare plant. He wanted to control it, to sell it. He must have known that the Queen's breath was far more valuable than a simple botanical specimen. It was worth a fortune, and he wasn't the only one who knew it. Dr. Wren was also involved, no doubt, as part of the network. They wanted access to this garden, this secret garden." Eleanor recoiled slightly, her hands trembling. "Then that means it wasn't just a coincidence that they targeted us. They were watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly, "and you were caught in the middle of it. But now, Eleanor, you understand why the garden had to be restored to its rightful purpose. Its secret was never meant to be sold to the highest bidder. It was meant to be preserved for the future." As Miss Marple and Eleanor continued their investigation, they uncovered more details in the journals, but it was clear that the legacy of the garden was far more intricate than either had anticipated. The Queen's breath, while rare, was not the only specimen hidden in that forgotten space. There were more plants listed in Mrs. Markham's mother-in-law's journals, each one more exotic and valuable than the next. The documents were carefully transferred to the local museum for safekeeping, where experts could analyze them and perhaps gain even more understanding of the garden's significance. But as Miss Marple and Eleanor stood together among the now restored paths of the garden, Miss Marple knew that the true mystery had been solved. "You've done something extraordinary, Eleanor," Miss Marple said softly, gazing at the blooming flowers around them. "You've not only restored the garden, but also its purpose. You've taken something dark and made it light again." Eleanor smiled, though there was still a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I never realized how much the garden could mean until I uncovered its secrets. But now I see that it's not just about plants. It's about preserving what's good and letting go of what's harmful." Miss Marple gave a small nod, her sharp eyes twinkling. "Indeed, it's about understanding what is worth preserving and what should remain hidden in the shadows." As they stood in the garden's center, Miss Marple felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The case had come to its final, peaceful conclusion, but the lessons learned would remain with Eleanor forever. And the garden, once a place of secrecy and intrigue, had now become a symbol of renewal and hope. In the years that followed, Meadowbrook House's garden became a renowned destination for horticulturists and nature lovers from across the globe. The Queen's breath and other rare plants were carefully preserved, and the garden became a living testament to the beauty and complexity of nature. Eleanor continued her work as a leading figure in the world of botanical preservation, advocating for the protection of rare species and sharing her knowledge with future generations. She often returned to the garden, finding solace in its quiet beauty and in the memory of what it had taught her. As for Miss Marple, she returned to her home in St. Mary Mead, where she continued her quiet observation of life's mysteries. Though she had solved countless cases, she knew that the real satisfaction came not from unraveling secrets, but from understanding the forces of human nature that lay behind them. And as the seasons passed, the garden at Meadowbrook House continued to bloom, its secrets now safely protected, its beauty shared with all who sought it. Miss Marple, as always, would be there to watch it all unfold. Months had passed since the final resolution of the mystery surrounding Meadowbrook House, yet Miss Marple's mind was ever vigilant. As the autumn leaves fell around her home in St. Mary Mead, she found herself reflecting on the threads that had woven the garden's history. Sometimes mysteries lingered in the corners of the mind, even after they appeared to be resolved. One crisp evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire with a cup of tea, a visitor came to her door. It was a familiar face. Lydia Markham, though there was something different in her appearance. Lydia looked older, perhaps more worn from the weight of the events that had unfolded, but her presence was still as dignified as ever. "Miss Marple," Lydia began, taking a seat across from her. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Lydia," Miss Marple replied gently. "Please come in. You're always welcome here." Lydia settled into the chair and seemed to gather her thoughts before speaking again. "I've come because I've been thinking about everything that has happened. About Eleanor, the garden, and the people who were involved. You were right, Miss Marple, about how everything has a way of unfolding, but there are things, questions that still remain." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "What sort of questions, Lydia?" "It's about Dr. Wren," Lydia said quietly. "I can't help but wonder if we ever truly uncovered everything about him. We know his connection to Carol, his involvement in the thefts, but there are still unanswered pieces. I've been meaning to ask you something. Do you think there was more to him than just a collector?" Miss Marple considered the question for a long moment. Dr. Wren had always struck her as more than a mere academic. There was a certain coldness to him, a calculating precision in his actions. His association with Carol had been a mystery in itself. But had there been more lurking in the shadows, more that had gone unnoticed? "I do believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Dr. Wren was not just after rare plants. He was after something far deeper, perhaps something related to the history of the garden itself. His interest seemed to go beyond mere curiosity about the floor. It was as though he sought to claim a piece of the past, to control it. Lydia nodded, her gaze distant. That's what I thought. There's something about him that doesn't sit right with me. Even after everything, I can't shake the feeling that we only know a fraction of the truth. Miss Marple watched Lydia with a thoughtful expression. Perhaps you're right, but sometimes, Lydia, the most dangerous truths are the ones we're not meant to see. Lydia looked at her, uncertainty clouding her face. What do you mean? Dr. Wren may have seen the garden as more than a collection of plants. He may have seen it as something symbolic, a link to an older tradition of botanical and alchemical knowledge. We cannot forget that the garden was a place of great personal significance to Mrs. Markham's mother-in-law. Perhaps Dr. Wren was more invested in her work than we ever realized. There could be something deeper, perhaps even more valuable, hidden in the garden's history. But, Miss Marple added with a knowing smile, we may never truly understand all of it, and that's for the best. Some mysteries are better left as they are. Lydia looked relieved, but there was still a lingering thought in her eyes. But there's something I don't understand. Why would Dr. Wren want to destroy what Mrs. Markham's mother-in-law worked so hard to build? If he was part of that world, part of the knowledge, why did he resort to manipulation and theft? Miss Marple paused, taking a sip of her tea. Because, Lydia, not all knowledge is meant to be shared. Dr. Wren was driven by a desire for control, but he miscalculated. He thought he could outsmart the system, turn everything to his advantage. But the garden itself resisted him. It never revealed its full secrets to him. It didn't want to be controlled. A few weeks later, as the winter chill set in, Lydia returned to Meadowbrook House, where Eleanor had taken over the stewardship of the garden and the rest of the estate. The garden had been fully restored, and it had become a place of serenity and growth, where visitors came to appreciate not only the beauty of the plants, but the resilience of the people who had restored it. But for Miss Marple, there was still a lingering sense that some unanswered questions remained. As winter wrapped the village of St. Mary Mead in its quiet cloak of snow, Miss Marple received a letter from Eleanor. The message was brief but poignant. Dear Miss Marple, I've been thinking a lot lately about the past and the choices we make. The garden, now fully restored, has become a symbol of all that we've been through. I've decided to leave St. Mary Mead for a while to continue my studies. There's so much more to learn, and I believe my journey is far from over. I'll be leaving for London, where I hope to further my work in botanical research and conservation. I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for me. I'll never forget what I've learned from you, and I'll always remember your quiet wisdom. Please take care of yourself. I'll visit again soon. Eleanor. Miss Marple read the letter carefully, feeling a sense of quiet pride for Eleanor's growth and the young woman she had become. It was not often that Miss Marple found herself in awe of someone, but Eleanor's transformation had been nothing short of remarkable. I suppose that's what they mean by growing into yourself, Miss Marple mused aloud, setting the letter down on the table. Eleanor was lost in the garden's shadow, but she has found her own light. The wind outside howled softly as Miss Marple turned her attention to the fire crackling in her hearth. It was a small thing, a simple comfort. Yet as she sat there alone, the lessons of the garden and the people who had passed through her life lingered in her thoughts. Sometimes, the greatest mysteries in life were not the ones that could be solved with sharp observation or logic. They were the ones that required patience, understanding, and a willingness to let things unfold in their own time. And that, Miss Marple thought, was the most important lesson of all. Years passed, and the garden at Meadowbrook House continued to thrive, becoming a renowned center for botanical research. Eleanor, now an established expert, frequently returned to St. Mary Mead, her visits always a source of joy and reflection. As she traveled the world, she shared her knowledge and discoveries, contributing to the preservation of rare plants for generations to come. As for Miss Marple, she lived her days quietly in St. Mary Mead, watching the world pass by at a gentle pace. She was often called upon to help with small mysteries, as always, but her most treasured moments were spent in quiet contemplation, tending her own modest garden, where secrets and mysteries had no place. Only the simple joy of watching things grow. And so, the legacy of the enchanted garden at Meadowbrook House lived on, not in the shadows of forgotten secrets, but in the bright future that lay ahead. Years had passed since the conclusion of the Meadowbrook House mystery, and Miss Marple had long since returned to the quiet routine of her life in St. Mary Mead. Her garden flourished, and the hum of village life continued as always. But Miss Marple knew that mysteries, like the seasons, were ever-changing. It was only a matter of time before another puzzle found its way to her door. It came on a crisp autumn afternoon, when the golden leaves of the trees danced in the breeze. A knock at her door interrupted her peaceful reflection. She rose from her favorite armchair, her joints creaking, and opened the door to find a familiar face. Inspector Craddock, a long-time acquaintance from her past investigations. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, his face grave. "I apologize for intruding, but I need your assistance. There's been a most unusual case, and I believe your insight might be invaluable." Miss Marple studied him with her usual calm demeanor. "Of course, Inspector. What's happened?" Craddock hesitated for a moment before speaking. "It's a case in the nearby village of Cherrington. A young woman named Margaret Thornfield has gone missing. She was last seen a few days ago, and her disappearance has raised concerns. What's more troubling is that there are signs of foul play." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with interest, though her face remained composed. "And you suspect something more than a simple disappearance?" Craddock nodded. "Yes. There's a family connection, Miss Marple. The Thornfields are a well-known family, and their estate is quite large. But there's something strange about Margaret's disappearance. Some of the staff have mentioned hearing unusual sounds around the grounds before she vanished. We also found a letter that she wrote before she left, and it seems to suggest she was afraid of something, or someone." Miss Marple took a long pause, absorbing the information. "I see. It's not often that a young woman simply vanishes without reason. I shall visit Cherrington with you, Inspector. Let's see what we can uncover." The following morning, Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock arrived at the Thornfield estate in Cherrington. The house was grand, set against a backdrop of rolling hills and surrounded by manicured gardens that contrasted with the unsettling atmosphere that seemed to hang over the place. The once vibrant grounds now appeared shadowed, as though something hidden beneath the surface was slowly coming to light. They were greeted by the butler, a stiff-lipped man named Mr. Granger, who led them inside and directed them to the drawing room where the Thornfield family had gathered. The family's matriarch, Mrs. Eleanor Thornfield, was seated by the fire, her eyes clouded with worry. She was a regal woman in her 60s with a commanding presence that suggested years of controlling her household. Margaret's father, Henry Thornfield, was a quieter man, his face drawn with concern. They were joined by Margaret's younger brother, Philip, who seemed more anxious than his parents. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming," Mrs. Thornfield said, her voice tight with emotion. "We are desperate. Margaret has always been a sensible girl. This is unlike her to disappear without a word. We fear something has happened to her." Miss Marple took a seat opposite them, her hands folded in her lap. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Thornfield. Could you tell me more about Margaret's recent behavior? Was there anything unusual that might have hinted at what she was feeling before her disappearance?" Mrs. Thornfield hesitated. "Well, Margaret had been somewhat distant in recent weeks. She'd spend a lot of time alone, reading or walking in the garden. She was always fond of nature, but she seemed restless, as though something was troubling her. I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought it was simply her young mind at work." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And what about her relationships with the other members of the household? Was there anyone she seemed particularly close to, or perhaps at odds with? Henry Thornfield, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Margaret was very close with our gardener, Mr. Edson. A quiet man, but very kind. I've noticed lately that they had long conversations when she would walk around the grounds. At first, I thought it was innocent. She's always had an interest in gardening, but now I'm not so sure. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. This Mr. Edson, has he been here long? Several years, Mrs. Thornfield replied. He's been a good employee, but in recent months, he's become more withdrawn. I'm not sure what has changed, but it's unsettling. Craddock, who had been observing the conversation, spoke up. We've already questioned Mr. Edson, but he seems genuinely concerned about Margaret's disappearance. He hasn't offered any useful information. However, there are rumors among the staff that he's been acting strangely, almost as though he's hiding something. Miss Marple sat back, her mind turning over the details. I see. There's one more thing I'd like to see, if I may. The letter Margaret left behind. Could you show it to me? Henry Thornfield reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a letter, which he handed to Miss Marple. It was written in Margaret's neat handwriting, though there was an underlying tension in the words. I am leaving. I don't know where I am going, but I cannot stay here. There is something wrong with the garden, something hidden that I can no longer ignore. I have to find out what it is before it's too late. Miss Marple's brow furrowed as she read the letter. The garden, she murmured. It seems that Margaret knew something about it, something that troubled her deeply. After a brief discussion with the Thornfields, Miss Marple and Craddock were led outside to the garden, where Margaret had spent so many solitary hours before her disappearance. The sprawling grounds were meticulously maintained, but there was an eerie stillness in the air. The garden was divided into several sections, flower beds, a maze, and a small grove of trees that overlooked a small pond. Miss Marple moved through the garden with Craddock at her side, her eyes taking in every detail. She could sense something hidden here, something that hadn't been noticed before. They stopped by a row of roses where Margaret had often walked. As Miss Marple bent to inspect the plants, she noticed a faint depression in the earth. Something had been disturbed recently. She knelt down and gently pushed aside the soil. After a moment, she uncovered something. A small, ornate key, rusted but clearly old. This seems important, Miss Marple said, holding up the key. I believe this is the key to something hidden here. Perhaps Margaret discovered it, or perhaps someone else did. But I think it's time we found out what it unlocks. Craddock frowned, his gaze following her as she examined the ground. But where would it fit? We've searched this place top to bottom. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The key always leads you somewhere, Inspector. It's just a matter of knowing where to look. They moved deeper into the garden, where Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught sight of a small wooden door, partially hidden behind ivy. It was barely noticeable, tucked in the shadow of a large oak tree. Miss Marple approached it with Craddock close behind, her heart racing with the anticipation of what they might uncover. With a steady hand, Miss Marple inserted the key into the lock, and with a soft click, the door creaked open. Beyond the door lay a hidden garden, unlike the others on the estate. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying plants. A thick blanket of moss covered the ground, and the shadows seemed to hold secrets that had been buried for years. As they stepped inside, Miss Marple's eyes quickly scanned the area. The garden was overgrown with creeping vines and tangled shrubs, but there was something about the place that felt wrong. It wasn't just a forgotten part of the estate. It felt like a place that had been deliberately hidden, sealed off from the rest of the world. At the far end of the garden, a small stone structure stood, partially obscured by ivy. Miss Marple moved toward it, her heart beating faster. This was it, the secret the garden had been hiding for so long. As she reached the structure, she found a small plaque, barely visible beneath the overgrowth. It was engraved with a single word: Thornfield. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against the stone. There was a sense of finality here, as though the garden held the last piece of the puzzle. But the mystery was far from over. Miss Marple turned to Craddock, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just uncovered. "This garden was never just a garden," she said softly. "It was a place where something was buried, something that had to be kept hidden." The truth was beginning to reveal itself, and it was a truth more tangled than any of them had imagined. As the weight of the discovery settled in, Miss Marple's sharp mind began to piece together the fragments of the puzzle. She stood still for a moment, her eyes scanning the secret garden where the moss-covered stones whispered of long-forgotten secrets. She felt a quiet sense of anticipation. She was on the cusp of uncovering something that had been hidden for generations. Craddock, standing beside her, looked at the plaque and then back at Miss Marple, his expression mixed with confusion and curiosity. "So, what does it mean, Miss Marple? Why the secrecy? Why hide this part of the garden?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully as she took a step toward the stone structure. "The Thornfield family," she mused aloud, "has always been obsessed with legacy. Their wealth, their history, it's all tied to the land and the garden. But I suspect there's more to this than mere horticultural passion." She bent down to examine the stone structure more closely, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the plaque. There was something off about the design, almost as if it were meant to shield something important. "I believe this structure was built not just as a garden feature, but as a marker, a tomb of sorts, a symbol of the family's deep connection to their past." Craddock's eyes widened. "A tomb? You think there's a body buried here?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple replied. "But I believe whatever is hidden here has been carefully guarded, and for good reason. The Thornfields have gone to great lengths to keep this part of their legacy a secret, and I suspect it has to do with something or someone from the family's history. It's clear Margaret Thornfield knew something about it, or at least suspected something." Craddock nodded, still digesting the implications of Miss Marple's words. "And the key? Do you think it's the key to this structure?" "I do," Miss Marple said, holding the key up in the light. "It fits the lock perfectly. But unlocking it is only the beginning. I believe we're dealing with something that was deliberately hidden, perhaps to protect the Thornfield name, or perhaps to prevent something from being exposed." Craddock turned the key in his hand thoughtfully. "But why the secrecy? What could they possibly want to keep hidden all these years?" Miss Marple's eyes shifted back to the stone structure, her mind racing. "I believe that's exactly what we're about to find out." Miss Marple and Craddock carefully cleared away the overgrowth around the stone structure, revealing a weathered door that had been hidden beneath ivy and moss. The key fit the lock with an easy turn, and the door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room within. The air inside was cool and damp, thick with the scent of earth and decay. The room was sparse, save for a few wooden shelves covered in dust and a stone pedestal at the center, upon which lay a single object, wrapped in yellowing cloth. Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes narrowing as she took in the surroundings. "There's something here, Craddock. Something that's been waiting to be uncovered for a long time." Craddock followed her inside, his flashlight illuminating the dark corners of the room. He hesitated for a moment before stepping toward the pedestal. "What do you think it is?" "I think it's something that the Thornfields have been hiding for a long time," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. "I believe it has to do with the history of the family, something from their past that they wanted to keep buried." Craddock carefully unwrapped the cloth from the pedestal, revealing a small, ornate box. It was made of dark wood, intricately carved with symbols that looked ancient, almost mystical. The box was sealed with a heavy lock, but there was no key in sight. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed as she took a step closer, examining the box. "This isn't just any family heirloom. It's a relic, something of great importance. But who would go to such lengths to keep it locked away? I don't know, Craddock said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. But I think we're about to find out. After careful consideration, Miss Marple and Craddock decided to bring the box back to Thornfield House. The estate was still under the Thornfields' control, and they needed answers from the family themselves. Mrs. Thornfield, Eleanor, and Philip gathered in the sitting room, their faces filled with curiosity and concern as Miss Marple explained what they had found in the hidden garden. I thought we had already uncovered all the family secrets, Mrs. Thornfield said, her voice shaky. But now it seems there's something even darker that's been buried. Something's been hidden in that garden for a long time, Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but direct. I believe it has to do with your family's past, something that someone, perhaps an ancestor, wanted to keep secret. Eleanor, Margaret's younger sister, spoke up, her voice hesitant. Could it be related to Margaret's disappearance? Is this what she discovered? Miss Marple nodded. I believe Margaret had found out something important, something she couldn't ignore. This box may hold the key to understanding why she disappeared. She placed the box on the table before them, her fingers brushing over the ornate carvings. I know you all have your suspicions, but there is one thing I can be certain of. The Thornfield family legacy is more complicated than you realize, and the truth may be far darker than you ever imagined. Eleanor's face paled as she looked at the box. What could be so terrible that my family would hide it from us? Only one way to find out, Miss Marple said, her voice calm yet firm. We need to open the box. With a quiet click, the lock on the box opened, revealing what lay inside. The object inside was wrapped in thick, old parchment paper, its edges frayed from age. As Miss Marple unwrapped it carefully, her breath caught in her throat. The box contained a set of ancient letters, dozens of them, each sealed with wax and bearing the Thornfield family crest. The letters were written in a formal, archaic script, and Miss Marple could sense the weight of history behind them. These letters, Miss Marple said softly, belong to your great-grandparents, Mrs. Thornfield. They were written during a time of great turmoil, just before your family's fortune began to shift. These letters speak of a betrayal, of a secret alliance with people who were once thought to be allies, but who later turned against the family. Mrs. Thornfield's face grew pale as she leaned forward. What do they say? What happened? Miss Marple continued to read, her voice steady as she revealed the contents of the letters. It seems your great-grandparents were involved in a controversial business deal, one that involved the acquisition of rare and valuable plants, much like the ones in your family's garden. But the deal was built on lies and deception. They were swindled by their own partners, who took the plants, the money, and their reputation. Craddock looked at Miss Marple, his eyes widening in realization. So, the Thornfields were the victims of a con, and the plants were taken. Not just any plants, Miss Marple said, but plants with significant historical value. These plants were sought after by powerful collectors, individuals with connections that could change the course of history. She turned to Mrs. Thornfield, who was visibly shaken. This is the secret your family has been hiding. The garden wasn't just a symbol of wealth, it was a symbol of your great-grandparents' betrayal. And Margaret discovered this truth. Then, Margaret's disappearance? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I believe Margaret was preparing to confront your family about what she had learned, Miss Marple said, her tone quiet but firm. She feared that someone wanted to keep these secrets buried, and she was determined to uncover the truth. Miss Marple stood by the window, looking out over the Thornfield estate as Craddock, Mrs. Thornfield, and Eleanor discussed the implications of what they had just uncovered. The room was quiet, filled with the weight of a family's hidden past. As Miss Marple gazed out at the sprawling gardens, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The mystery had been solved, but the revelations had left their mark on everyone involved. Sometimes, uncovering the truth could be just as unsettling as the mystery itself. The Thornfields would never be the same again, but at least they could begin to rebuild their legacy, this time with honesty and transparency. And for Miss Marple, the puzzle had come to its natural conclusion. She turned from the window with a gentle smile, knowing that her work here was done. After the dust had settled at Thornfield House and the mystery of Margaret's disappearance had been resolved, Miss Marple found herself back in her quiet village of St. Mary Mead. She was content, though she felt the familiar stirrings of curiosity about the world around her. Despite her years, Miss Marple remained sharp, always attentive to the small details that others might miss. She spent her days tending to her garden, reading and listening to the stories that came with the village life. Yet as she knew all too well, the peace was never permanent. Another mystery would find its way to her door soon enough. But for now, St. Mary Mead was calm. As the seasons shifted, Miss Marple sat by her window, sipping her tea and reflecting on the case she had just solved. The Thornfield family, though forever changed by the secrets revealed, had come to terms with the past. Eleanor had expressed gratitude for Miss Marple's help, vowing to take better care of the garden that had once been a symbol of betrayal. As Miss Marple gazed out over the peaceful landscape, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The garden was once again a place of life and renewal. The legacy of the Thornfield family had been forever altered, but the mystery had been laid to rest. It was a quiet evening when Miss Marple was once again interrupted by a knock at her door. She had just finished a light supper and was preparing to settle in with a book when the sound of someone at her doorstep startled her. "Miss Marple," came the voice from the other side of the door. She opened it to find a young man standing there, his face unfamiliar but his expression earnest. He wore a heavy coat against the chill evening air, and his eyes were wide with a mix of curiosity and anxiety. "Yes, how can I help you?" Miss Marple asked, her voice as calm as ever, though she couldn't help but feel the stirrings of intrigue. The young man hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Miss Marple, but I've heard of your reputation, and I think you might be able to help me. My name is Edward Lawrence, and I'm in need of your assistance. It's rather urgent." "Come inside, Mr. Lawrence," Miss Marple said, stepping aside to allow him entry. "Please, tell me what brings you here." Edward Lawrence entered, taking off his coat and glancing around the quaint, cozy room before sitting down at the small table where Miss Marple often worked on her puzzles. She poured him a cup of tea and sat down opposite him, waiting for him to explain his reason for coming. "I've been involved in a strange situation, Miss Marple," Edward began, his hands shaking slightly as he held the cup. "It's about my uncle, Charles Lawrence. He's recently passed away, and in the process of sorting through his belongings, I've discovered something unsettling." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Unsettling, you say?" Edward nodded, his eyes filled with concern. "Yes, my uncle was a wealthy man, with a reputation for being a collector of rare books and artifacts. When he passed, I inherited his estate. But as I've been going through his things, I've found evidence of something I can't quite explain. Hidden papers, strange symbols, and references to a mystery that I can't seem to solve." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. "It seems we may have another puzzle on our hands, Mr. Lawrence. What exactly did you find?" Edward's face grew pale as he set the cup down. "A journal, Miss Marple. It was hidden among my uncle's things beneath a floorboard in his study. The writing is cryptic, filled with references to an old case, something involving a missing artifact. I've tried to make sense of it, but I can't seem to piece it all together." "An artifact, you say? And this journal, does it mention any names, dates, or locations that might help us understand this mystery?" Edward nodded, his voice tense. "Yes. There's one name that keeps appearing, the Black Rose. It's mentioned in connection with an event that happened many years ago, something to do with a robbery, a hidden treasure, and a man who vanished without a trace. My uncle seemed to think it was an important part of a long-forgotten case, but I don't know where to start looking for answers. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her mind whirring as she absorbed the information. "The Black Rose," she repeated softly. "A name from the past, perhaps. This sounds like something that has been buried for a long time." Edward nodded, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I've tried searching for anything related to it, but all the trails seem to lead to dead ends. There are no records, no clues. It's as if my uncle was the only one who knew anything about it." Miss Marple's sharp eyes gleamed with quiet determination. "Mr. Lawrence, you've come to the right place. This Black Rose may be the key to solving this mystery. I have no doubt that we can uncover the truth." The following day, Miss Marple accompanied Edward Lawrence to his uncle's estate. It was an imposing old mansion, set on a hill with sweeping views of the surrounding countryside. The house had an air of mystery about it, with its dark wood paneling and winding hallways that seemed to hold whispers from the past. They made their way to Charles Lawrence's study, a room that was filled with shelves of books, artifacts, and papers. Miss Marple immediately noticed a thick layer of dust covering much of the furniture, as though the room had been undisturbed for quite some time. Edward led her to a large desk where the journal had been found, and Miss Marple carefully picked it up. The journal was old, its leather cover cracked with age. She opened it to the first page and began reading aloud the faded ink. "The Black Rose is a symbol of lost things, of treasures hidden and never meant to be found. It is said that those who search for it are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, and the consequences are never what they expect." Edward listened intently, his face growing pale. "That's the first entry. There are many more, but they don't make much sense. They talk about a treasure, a secret society, and a robbery that took place in this very town many years ago." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "The Black Rose, I believe, refers to something more than just an artifact. It's a symbol, perhaps of guilt or a dangerous secret. Your uncle may have been involved in something far larger than you realize." As Miss Marple flipped through the pages, she began to piece together a history of intrigue, one that spanned decades and involved people long since forgotten. The more she read, the clearer it became that the mystery was not just about a missing treasure, it was about a family secret that had been buried for generations. Over the next few weeks, Miss Marple and Edward Lawrence worked tirelessly, following the clues in the journal and uncovering a web of secrets connected to the Black Rose. They learned that the treasure in question was hidden within the estate, and its whereabouts were closely guarded by those who knew its significance. But as they got closer to the truth, danger began to loom. There were attempts to sabotage their efforts, mysterious figures who seemed to be watching their every move. Edward's own life was threatened, and Miss Marple knew that they were on the verge of uncovering something far darker than either of them had anticipated. Miss Marple's thoughts raced as she stood in the study one evening, looking at a map that had been tucked inside the journal. The Black Rose, it seemed, was not just a symbol. It was a key to a secret hidden beneath the very foundation of the estate. But the final discovery came in the form of a letter, written by Charles Lawrence himself, just before his death. It explained everything. The Black Rose was not a treasure. It was a secret that had the power to change the world. In a dramatic turn of events, Miss Marple and Edward uncovered the true meaning of the Black Rose and the role it had played in Charles Lawrence's life. They confronted the villain behind the mystery, a long-lost relative who had been pulling the strings from the shadows, using the Black Rose to manipulate the past. But Miss Marple, as always, had anticipated every move, and the villain was finally unmasked. Justice was served, and the secret of the Black Rose was no longer a mystery.